On a Thursday afternoon, the CEO of Aldridge Prestige Motors made a joke about a deed. She stood in her showroom beside an Aston Martin that 3 factory-certified specialists had failed to start in 11 months, and she told a mechanic in a flannel shirt that if he could fix it, the building his shop rented would be his. The room laughed. Nobody there knew what was waiting under the hood of that car, because nobody had ever heard of the man who built the engine inside it. Stay with this story, because what happened when he opened that hood changes everything about where value hides and who gets to see it. Victoria Aldridge did not make the joke casually. She made it the way a person swings a door shut on a room they have already decided contains nothing worth their time. The Aston Martin DBS had been the crown piece of her private collection for 3 years, and for 11 of those months, it had sat at the center of her showroom floor under the warm amber lighting, clean and silent and completely dead. Not stalled, not intermittent, not running rough, just dead. No spark, no crank, no diagnostic path that any of her people could trace to a source. 3 specialists had come through that showroom. The first was a factory-certified Aston Martin technician flown in from Chicago who spent 4 days with the car and wrote a failure report blaming the engine control unit. The second replaced the ECU, spent 6 more days, and wrote a report blaming the wiring harness. The third bypassed the harness entirely, ran every circuit individually, spent 3 weeks, and produced a final report that ended with a single typed line. Fault origin untraceable with standard diagnostic protocol. That report sat on Victoria's desk for 2 weeks before she stopped looking at it. Nate Harlow hadn't come to the showroom that day to look at the Aston Martin. He had come to ask for an extension on the rent. His shop, Harlow Auto, occupied the ground floor of a low-slung commercial building 3 blocks south of the Aldridge Prestige showroom, and the building belonged to a holding company that Victoria controlled through a subsidiary. The rent was 3 days past due. Nate had the money, but the check from a fleet client had been delayed, and he had needed to buy brake rotors for a teacher's Subaru that morning because the teacher needed her car by Friday and couldn't afford to wait. So Nate had come to ask for a few more days. And while he sat in the waiting room with his hands folded and his cap on his knee, Victoria had walked past him on her way back from the service bay, stopped, looked at him, and decided to make it sport. She announced the dare from the showroom floor. She did not lower her voice or pull him aside. She stood next to the Aston Martin in front of her service manager and 2 of her technicians and said, clearly and with a smile she did not bother to hide, that if this man could make that car start, she would hand him the deed to his building. The service manager, a man named Derek Pratt, did not laugh. He looked at the floor. The 2 technicians did not look at the floor. They laughed, and the sound carried across the polished concrete and the mirror finish, and the leather chairs that cost more per unit than most people spent on a work week of lunches. Nate did not argue. He did not flinch. He looked at the car for a long moment, the way a person looks at something they are fairly certain they understand, but need a moment to confirm. And then he nodded once and walked toward it. And the reason he did not argue is a story that begins 20 years earlier, in a one-man shop on the east side of town, with a man whose name nobody in that showroom had ever heard. Nate Harlow woke at 5:15 every morning without an alarm. He moved through the house in a particular order. Coffee first, then oatmeal on the stove, then 3 quiet knocks on the door at the end of the hallway. The knocks were never louder than necessary, and Lily always answered them the same way. A small groan, then the shuffle of feet, then the door opening to reveal a 9-year-old with tangled hair and serious eyes who looked at her father as though he were the most reliable thing in a world that had given her very few reliable things. Their house was attached to the shop. The shop was called Harlow Auto, a name that told people exactly what to expect and made no attempt to tell them anything more. The building was low and wide, set back from a service road behind a gravel lot that filled unevenly when it rained. The paint on the exterior had faded to a color that might once have been green, but had long since settled into something closer to indifference. The sign above the bay door had 2 working letters fewer than it had been installed with, and the interior smelled the way every shop Nate had ever worked in smelled, which is to say, it smelled like work. Nate's hands told his story before he ever opened his mouth. The palms were calloused, the knuckles permanently lined with engine grease that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully removed. and the grip was the grip of a man who had spent 2 decades working on machines most people trade in before they break. He did not talk about his work the way some mechanics do, with the performative authority of someone who needs you to know they know. He talked about it the way a person states a fact they find neither satisfying nor entertaining. The alternator is done. The brakes are on the bench. Come back Thursday. The mentor was Frank Sutter. Frank ran a one-man engine shop on the east side of town for 32 years before he died, and if you were not from that part of the city, you had never heard of him. Frank built engines the way a violin maker builds instruments, by hand, by feel, by the specific logic of metal under stress. He did not advertise. He did not post his work online. He built custom engine blocks for clients who found him through other clients, and each one carried small modifications that only he understood, because each one was built for a specific car and a specific driver and a specific set of conditions that no factory engineer in a cubicle in Coventry or Stuttgart would ever account for. Frank took Nate in when Nate was 19, not as an employee, not as a customer, not as a student in any formal sense. He simply let the boy stand in his shop and watch, and then one day he handed him a torque wrench and said, "Try that." And when Nate got it wrong, Frank showed him what wrong felt like through the handle, the particular vibration of a bolt that had been taken past its yield point, and Nate never forgot that feeling for the rest of his life. Frank taught him how to listen to an engine the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, how to read stress marks in a frame the way an engineer reads a blueprint, how to see past rust and cracked paint and dead batteries to the mechanical soul underneath. He also taught him something that no trade school covers, which is that the world will not notice what you know unless it needs something from you, and that the right response to that fact is not anger, but simply more work. Frank died 4 years ago, heart failure, sudden, at his workbench. Nate still had the small wooden mallet Frank used for seating valve guides, and the handwritten notebook Frank kept for every engine he ever built, filled with measurements and notes in a shorthand that Frank had invented and that nobody but Frank could read. Or so Nate had thought, until the day he realized that he could read it too, because Frank had been writing it for him all along. And that notebook, it turns out, was about to matter in a way that Nate couldn't have predicted, because somewhere in that showroom sat a machine that only Frank's writing could explain. What distinguished the 3 specialists who failed, if anyone had been paying close enough attention, was not that they were bad at their jobs. They were very good at their jobs. That was the problem. They were so good at their jobs that they could only see what the factory specifications told them was there. Each specialist approached the Aston Martin the same way. They connected diagnostic equipment to the OBD port and read the fault codes, which returned normal, then tested the fuel delivery system and found pressure within spec, then checked the ignition coils and found spark at every cylinder, then measured compression across all cylinders and found it even and within tolerance, then verified cam timing against the factory service manual and found it aligned to the published specification. Every test returned the same result. The car was fine. The car was completely fine, and the car wouldn't start. What the specialists couldn't see, because their training had taught them to look at what the factory said the car should be, rather than at what the car actually was that the engine block under that hood was not factory. It had been replaced with a custom-built block, hand-finished, carrying modifications that existed nowhere in any Aston Martin service manual or technical bulletin or parts catalog. The block looked close enough to original that a trained eye would accept it as factory. The head geometry matched the published drawings. The intake routing followed the standard configuration. But the modifications changed how fuel moved through the intake runners, how the timing chain seated against the cam sprocket, and how the thermal management system behaved under load. Every specialist tested against the factory blueprint. None of them realized they were reading the wrong map. The car was fine, if the car was what the manual said it was. But the car wasn't what the manual said it was. The car was something else entirely, built by a man who had never once consulted a manual because he did not need one. And the difference between what the manual described and what sat under that hood was small enough to escape any eye that wasn't looking for it, and large enough to keep the engine from ever catching. Which is why, the next morning, a man who had never consulted a manual either walked through the service bay door and set his tool bag on the floor beside that car. Nate returned the next morning. He entered through the service bay entrance, not the customer door, the way a person enters a place where they intend to work, rather than a place where they intend to wait. He was wearing the same flannel shirt and work boots. His hand still carried the faint trace of engine oil from a brake job he had finished at 10 the night before, because the teacher had needed her Subaru by Friday, and he had promised her it would be ready. And a promise like that, in Nate's world, is not a social gesture. It is a load-bearing structure. Lily was at school. He had left her lunch on the counter with a note that said, "Back this afternoon," the way he always did when a job might run long. She would find the note when she came home, and she wouldn't worry, because her father had never once given her a reason to worry about whether he would come back. Derek Pratt stood at the edge of the bay with his arms crossed. He had been Victoria's service manager for 9 years, and he had overseen all 3 specialist visits, and he had signed off on every failure report. He watched Nate set his tool bag on the floor beside the Aston Martin with the particular stillness of a man who does not expect to see anything new, but cannot afford to look away in case he does. The showroom was designed to make certain people feel comfortable and everyone else feel out of place. The floors were polished concrete sealed to a mirror shine. The lighting was the warm amber of expensive hotel lobbies. The air carried the faint mingled scent of leather conditioner and new carpet and the solvent they used on the display chrome. Nate did not look out of place. He looked like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, because he was looking at the car, not at the room, and the car was the only thing in that space that had ever mattered. He set his hand flat on the fender and stood there for a moment, very still, the way a person listens for something they are fairly certain is there, but cannot afford to miss. 3 days past due on rent, a 9-year-old waiting at home with a note on the counter, a building that would stay someone else's property unless he could make a dead engine draw a breath. He reached down and lifted the hood. The engine was clean, well maintained, obviously cared for by someone who valued the car and understood what lived inside it. To a factory-trained specialist, it looked correct. The block casting, the head geometry, the intake routing, all of it close enough to original that the eye accepted it without question. A specialist would see what they expected to see, and they would move on. But Nate was not a factory-trained specialist. Nate was Frank Sutter's student, and Frank Sutter did not build engines that looked like everyone else's. He built engines that looked like they were supposed to look until you looked closer. And the difference between looking and looking closer was the entire distance between failure and understanding. The first thing Nate noticed was the block casting number. It was not an Aston Martin part number. It was a number in Frank's personal coding system, a shorthand he used in his notebook. 3 letters, a dash, 4 digits. FSE 0721. Frank Sutter engine, July 21st. Frank marked every block he built with the date he finished it, using a small hand punch that left the characters shallow enough to miss unless you were looking for them. Nate had seen that format 1,000 times. It was on every page of Frank's handwritten notes. The format was not a serial number, it was a signature. The second thing Nate noticed was the intake manifold. Frank always modified the intake runners on his custom builds. He believed the factory geometry was optimized for emissions compliance, not for power delivery. And he reshaped the runner exits by hand to change how fuel mixed with air at the specific RPM range his clients used most. The modification was invisible unless you knew what you were looking at. A factory specialist would see a manifold and move on. Nate saw Frank's hand. He saw the particular curve of the runner exit, the slight widening at the transition point, the telltale finish marks left by a carbide burr on aluminum that had been shaped by someone who understood airflow the way some people understand music, by feel and by instinct, and by decades of paying attention to what happens when you change one small thing and listen to what the engine says about it. The third thing was the timing chain guide. Frank used a custom-milled guide with a slightly different tooth profile. He did this because he had found, over 30 years of building engines, that the factory guide created a harmonic vibration at a specific load point that accelerated wear on the chain tensioner. His guide eliminated the vibration, but changed the chain path by 2 millimeters, a distance so small it wouldn't register on any standard measurement taken during a diagnostic inspection, because no diagnostic inspection measures the chain path. It measures the chain tension, and the chain tension was within spec. But 2 millimeters was enough to make the chain sit slightly differently on the cam sprocket under load, enough to throw off cam timing by half a degree at high RPM, enough to make the car run perfectly at idle and stall under the specific combination of throttle position and engine temperature that no one had thought to test. Nate stood there for a long moment. He did not speak. His hand was still resting on the fender. The silence in that showroom was not the silence of confusion or disappointment. It was the particular silence that forms when someone begins to understand the full geometry of what they got wrong, and the one who got it wrong was not Nate. The silence belonged to the room because the people who had failed to fix this car did not fail because they were incompetent. They failed because they did not know that the engine they were diagnosing was built by a man named Frank Sutter, and the only person in the world who could read that engine was standing right there with his hand on the fender and Frank's coding system memorized in a way that no classroom could ever teach and no credential could ever certify. Nate opened his tool bag. He did not pull out a diagnostic meter or a laptop or any of the equipment the three specialists had connected to the OBD port. He pulled out a set of feeler gauges, a small inspection mirror on an extendable arm, and a mechanic stethoscope, the kind that lets you listen to the internal sounds of an engine through a metal probe, the kind that has been obsolete in most dealerships for 15 years because the computer does the listening now, except the computer can only hear what its sensors are programmed to hear, and the sound Nate was looking for wasn't in any sensor's vocabulary. He asked Derek Pratt to turn the key. The engine cranked. It cranked smoothly, evenly, with full compression and proper fuel pressure, the way an engine cranks when everything is working, and the only thing missing is the one thing that would make it catch. Every gauge read normal. Every sensor returned its expected value, but the engine did not start. It cranked and cranked and cranked, and the fuel was there, and the spark was there, and the compression was there, and the car remained dead. Nate placed the stethoscope probe against the timing cover and listened. He heard the chain turning and the tensioner cycling and the guide teeth engaging the chain links in a rhythm that was almost even, almost symmetrical, almost perfectly matched to the cam rotation, except not quite. There was a sound buried in that rhythm that a diagnostic computer would never flag, because the computer was reading sensor outputs, not mechanical resonance. The computer was looking at data while Nate was listening to metal, and the metal was telling him something that the data couldn't. The 2 millimeter offset in the chain path was doing exactly what Frank's custom guide had been designed to prevent in one specific way, but it was also doing something Frank may not have anticipated. Under cranking load, when the starter motor was turning the engine at low RPM and the chain was under the particular tension that cranking produces, the offset created a barely perceptible harmonic that retarded the intake cam timing just enough at the critical moment. The spark was firing into a cylinder that hadn't quite finished its compression stroke. The fuel ignited, but the piston was still rising, and the energy of the ignition pushed against the rising piston instead of driving it down, and the two forces canceled each other out. The engine had full spark and full fuel and full compression, and it never caught, because the timing was off by the thickness of a coat of paint at the exact moment it mattered most. And that thickness was enough to keep the whole machine from ever drawing a breath. Nate straightened up. He did not look triumphant. He looked the way a person looks when they have found something they were fairly certain was there, but needed to confirm before they could move forward. He set the stethoscope on the workbench and turned to Derek Pratt, and he told him, quietly and without any drama at all, that the timing chain guide needed to be replaced with the factory part, and that the intake cam sprocket needed to be retimed to factory specification. He said it the way a person states a fact they find neither satisfying nor entertaining. This is what is wrong, this is how to fix it. The rest is just work. But work, in Nate's experience, is where things go sideways, and the next 24 hours would test whether the answer he had found in the metal was the right one. Derek Pratt ordered the factory timing chain guide and the cam sprocket from the nearest Aston Martin parts depot that morning. The parts arrived the next day before noon. Nate installed them himself. He worked slowly, methodically, the way Frank had taught him. Every bolt torqued to spec, every gasket seated clean, every hose reconnected with the clips aligned the way they had been aligned at the factory, because the factory had been right about most things, and the only thing they had been wrong about was the chain guide. and Frank had been the one who was right about that, and now the factory part was going back in because the factory part, in a factory engine, was exactly what it was supposed to be. The work took 4 hours. Victoria watched from the showroom floor for the first hour. She stood near the leather chairs with her arms folded, watching Nate's hands move through the engine bay the way a person watches something they do not understand but cannot stop looking at. Then she left, and what happened after she left was something she would hear about from Derek Pratt instead of seeing for herself, which is the cost of walking away from a room before the work is finished. Derek Pratt watched the whole time. He stood at the edge of the bay with his arms still crossed, but his face was different now. Not dismissive, but attentive, the way a person looks when they are watching someone do something they did not know could be done. When Nate finished, he wiped his hands on a shop towel and walked to the driver's door. He did not hesitate. He did not pause for effect. He turned the key. The engine started. It started the way a well-built engine starts, immediately, smoothly, with the low, even hum of 12 cylinders finding their rhythm and settling into it as though they had been waiting for this moment for 11 months and were finally being allowed to do the thing they were built to do. The sound filled the showroom. It wasn't a dramatic sound. It was the sound of something working correctly. And in that room, at that moment, the sound of something working correctly was the loudest thing anyone had ever heard. Derek Pratt's arms came uncrossed, and the two technicians who were working on other cars in the adjacent bay stopped what they were doing and looked over, and the receptionist at the front desk looked up from her screen. The sound of that engine running filled every corner of that space, and the space hadn't heard it in almost a year, and the fact that it was running now meant that everything every specialist had written in every failure report wasn't an explanation for why the car wouldn't start. It was a record of the fact that they hadn't understood what they were looking at. Nate let the engine run for 30 seconds. He checked the idle RPM on the tachometer. He revved it once, listening with his whole body the way Frank had taught him, feeling the vibration through the steering wheel and the seat and the floor, and the engine was clean. The timing was correct. The harmonic was gone. The car ran the way a car runs when the person who built the engine and the person who understood the engine are the same kind of person, and the person who did not understand the engine has been replaced by someone who does. He turned it off, closed the hood, and set his hand flat on the fender for a moment, the same way he had when he first walked in. Victoria returned when Derek called her. She walked into the showroom and stood in front of the car and looked at Nate. She did not speak for several seconds. The silence was not the performance silence she had used when she made the dare. This silence was the silence of someone who has just watched something they did not believe was possible happen in front of them, and who is trying to decide what it means about the thing they saw and what it means about themselves for not having seen it. Victoria did not hand over the deed that day. She handed it over 3 days later, in her office, across a desk that was wider than it needed to be and made of a dark wood that was selected to create distance between the person sitting behind it and the person sitting across from it. Nate sat in the chair. The deed was on the desk between them, signed and notarized, the paper crisp and official, and carrying the weight of something that had changed hands because of a joke that was no longer funny. She pushed it across the surface with 2 fingers, the way a person moves something they no longer want to hold. But before she did, she told him something. Not because she had to, because the look on Nate's face when the engine started had told her that he knew something about that car that she did not, and she needed to understand what it was before she could let go of it. Nate told her about Frank Sutter. He told her about the engine block and the intake modifications and the timing chain guide. He told her that the block casting number was in Frank's personal code and that the engine was built on July 21st of a year that Frank's notebook would specify, and that only Frank's hand could have shaped those intake runners the way they were shaped. He told her that the reason 3 factory-certified specialists couldn't fix her car is that they were diagnosing an engine that does not exist in any service manual, because one man in a one-man shop on the east side of town built it by hand 20 years ago, and the manual for that engine was written in a shorthand that only one other person could read, and that person was sitting across the desk from her. Victoria listened. Her face changed as he spoke, not the way a person's face changes when they hear something surprising, the way it changes when they hear something they already knew but hadn't yet connected to the thing in front of them. She told Nate that the car had been consigned to her dealership by an estate. The owner had died without family, without a will that mentioned the car, and the executor had sold it as part of the estate liquidation. She had purchased it from her own dealership because it was a beautiful car and she wanted it for her private collection. She did not know the engine was custom. She did not know the man who built it. Nate asked her the name on the estate. She told him. It was Frank Sutter. The room went quiet. Not the performance quiet of the dare, not the stunned quiet of the showroom when the engine started. The particular quiet that forms when two people understand that they have been standing on opposite sides of the same grave without knowing it. Frank Sutter had no family. His estate was liquidated by the state because there was no will and no next of kin. His shop was demolished. His tools were sold at auction. His notebooks, his handwritten records of every engine he ever built, were classified as personal papers of no market value and destroyed, except for the one notebook that Nate has, the one Frank gave him the year before he died, the one that contains the measurements and the shorthand and the coding system that nobody but Frank could read, except Nate can read it, because Frank taught him. Because Frank had been writing that notebook for two people all along, the one who built the engines and the one who would outlive him and carry the knowledge forward. And Nate hadn't understood that until after Frank was gone, and he opened the notebook one night and found that he could read every page, because every measurement and every note and every comment in the margins was written in a language that Frank had invented, and that Nate had learned without realizing he was learning it, the way a child learns the sound of his father's voice, not by being taught, but by being there. Nate took the deed. He folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket, next to the small wooden mallet he carries in his tool bag and the photograph of Lily that he keeps in his wallet. He did not thank Victoria. He did not gloat. He stood up, nodded once, the same way he had nodded when she made the dare, and walked out into the November air. That evening, he picked Lily up from school. She climbed into the truck and buckled her seatbelt and asked him how his day was. He told her he fixed a car. She asked what kind. He told her it was a car that somebody very good built a long time ago, and that it just needed someone who knew how to listen to it. She nodded, the way she always does when he says something she doesn't fully understand, but trusts completely. And they drove home to a building that now belonged to them. Some things don't need to be said. They only need to be done. If you believe that, subscribe to Dad Legacy Justice. The next story is already waiting.